So for you, Anne, a rather different experience reading my book than for Seamus and Oliver, who were reading it as scholars and people knowing Ted's poetry. But could I begin by asking you, what did it feel like to read a book where some of the characters, many of the characters, are people that you knew?
I think it was quite it's been quite an emotional few weeks since I first read the book. And I think this is because in so many instances these people were very prominent in my past, and in most cases in a very happy way. But Ted, from a very early age, was someone who was part of my life, but interrupted this fairly calm life in this Yorkshire valley, because often when he came home, it was to put into place times of chaos in his life. So there were some very happy times, but there were also some very sad times.
Yeah. One of the crucial times in his life where he did spend time there was when in the late 1960s he bought this house called Lum Bank. And if any of you have been to Heptonstall, Seamus read so beautifully, one of my absolute favourite poems, the Heptonstall Cemetery poem, the house that his parents had moved to by this time was up on the hill on this road that leads up towards Heptonstall Cemetery, a house called the Beacon with a fantastic view. But from the Beacon you look down into a dip to some woods, and there was this other house down there, Lum Bank, which Ted considered buying in 1963 at the time of Sylvia's death, but actually ended up buying in 1969. He eventually gave it over to the Avon Foundation for writing courses, and that's an interesting part of the story. But you saw a bit of Ted and indeed the children in that Lum Bank period.
By the time Ted bought Lum Bank, his parents' house was literally... Lum Bank sat in a wooded valley. It was a mill owner's house. It had the mill, the chimney, and the long house. And Ted's parents had lived in the house at the top of the lane, and we lived 2 minutes away from them in another house at a place called Heptonstall Slack. So by the time Ted came back to Yorkshire, Assia had died. Things were difficult. He had these 2 small children, and he came home because he needed the family to sort of breathe some order into all of this. You know, he was in a relationship by then with Brenda Hedden, and Brenda came with him, and Brenda had 2 children of her own. And for a time, I think it looked like it might work. You know, he got back into some sort of flow. The children went to school. They were sad little things, certainly in those early days after Assia Wevell's death. I think she had tried her very best to be some sort of mother to them. And of course, in the meantime, she'd had a child of her own. So not only did Frida and Nicholas live this family unit life with Assia Wevell, but they also had by then a sibling. And when Assia died, the sibling, obviously, his life came to an end as well. So it was locked into this thing of wanting to be in this home in Yorkshire and somehow get some order into what was really chaos, I suppose. Yeah.
I found Brenda Hedden a very impressive, very strong woman. I think in a way she was pretty well the only woman who ever actually dumped Ted. But I think there was great strength in that bond. And I remember you mentioned to me recently that many years later you saw Ted down in Exeter and she was on the platform. What?
No, Ted spoke to me later and he said something. He said, I had a really strange experience. He said, I got off a train. I arrived back in Exeter on the train, and by then he'd be in his 50s. He'd have been in his mid-50s by then. And he said, I got out of the carriage, and I was walking down the platform, and in the distance, he said, I saw the back of this person, and he said it was Brenda. And he said it brought back all these memories of... she was really quite... she had a very magnetic personality. She was bohemian. She was beautiful. she was lively and everything that she was just a lovely person. But she had she had a husband. She'd left. She had 2 children, who again complicated the situation, and I think that was she left. She left Ted. She went to be the housekeeper for a guy called David Garnock. He was Lord Garnock. And but that was literally a few hundred yards from the house in which we lived. And while she was still there, Ted married Carol. He brought Carol to Yorkshire. Carol at that time was 21 years old. And when I think about having a 21-year-old daughter now, and I think about projecting her into a position where she was with a man who was considerably older, and looking after 2 children who were probably traumatised. It was an unusual situation to observe.
It certainly was.
Yeah.
Family was obviously very much a sort of grounding for Ted, as you said. Seamus and I share this huge admiration for the first book of poems where he really talked about his childhood and the village and the moors, his home, the Calder Valley, Remains of Elmet. And I think I'm right in saying Melvyn Bragg made a South Bank show about that. And I believe that sort of Ted came home to watch it. Can you tell us about that?
I suppose it was that he thought that this was where it should be. He should experience what it was going to be like to watch this with his family. In the end, he didn't watch it. But he arrived the day before with this big copper pan. And I can remember my mother looking at this pan and thinking, oh dear, what am I going to do with this? And he placed it on the Arga, and it filled the whole of the Arga top. And inside it was venison, and he was very proud. It had taken him days to, he'd hung the venison, and it had all been matured and everything else. And then he brought the cases of red wine, and he wanted it to be he wanted it to have a sort of celebration. He wanted it to be a celebration of this. So we all sat down, we ate the food, we all sat down to watch the South Bank show, and Ted disappeared. And he walked the paths of his childhood while this was going on. He obviously didn't want to be part of this bit. It was too, but happy memories. Yeah,
and he sometimes brought friends, other writers, back home, didn't he? Seamus kindly said my book has many good anecdotes, and I could have had far more. And I think an anecdote I particularly now regret leaving out is a number of people who met Ted in various times, usually when he went to poetry festivals. Ted would arrive in his car, his battered old car, he was a terrible driver, and then he'd open the boot, and it would be full of corduroy trousers, and he'd offer his host a sort of bargain on some corduroy trousers. And this is, there's a theme in the book. He's always got these money-making schemes, but I wish I'd done a little bit more on corduroy trousers, and I think you had a corduroy trouser story.
He was just passionate about corduroy trousers. My grandfather and Uncle Walt had started this business, or Uncle Walt had started this business, and over the years it had developed into making clothes for hunting, shooting and fishing. So of course this was Ted's passion, but also his passion was dressing his friends. So they would arrive in Hebden Bridge or in Mythenroyd, and they would be preceded by a very good lunch, usually where they probably consumed a lot more than was healthy for them. And then they would come to be measured. And so Seamus Heaney would arrive, or Melvyn Bragg would arrive, and they would climb to the top of the stairs and be duly measured for these trousers. And then, of course, the stairs are quite steep, and they would have to somehow navigate the steps back to Ted's Morris Traveller, and with a stack of trousers he was taking for his... Yeah.
It's extraordinary that was the Morris Traveller that Sylvia had driven around the lanes of Devon in, and I was one of the lovely things in writing a book is doing the picture research. And I found a fabulous old picture that was taken by a woman called Frances McCulloch, who was Ted's editor at Harper & Row in New York. And it's been a great pleasure for me that my book is published globally by HarperCollins, and Harper in New York was Ted and Sylvia's publisher. And it's a photo that shows the famous elm trees at Court Green that Sylvia wrote her great poem, The Moon and the Elm Trees, about. But in the picture, you can just see the Morris Traveller. And after Sylvia's death, Ted couldn't bear to get rid of it. He carried on driving it, and then eventually it just stayed in the driveway of Court Green. It was one of those old sort of half-timbered cars, and it just sort of rotted away, but he couldn't bear to let it go.
There were actually two of them.
There were two Morris Travellers.
There was a green Morris Traveller and there was a maroon Morris Traveller.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It is a tragic story, and in a way, among the most tragic elements of it is that Ted and Sylvia's son, Nicholas, took his own life 6 years ago now. Olwyn, Ted's sister, who was a wonderful, wonderful help to me. Sadly, she's not well now, but from 2010 to 2012, when I was doing the research, she was a fount of information. And two things I remember in particular about Olwyn in relation to tragedy. One was I went to see her very shortly after the news of Nick's suicide, and she and Frida had to fly all the way to Alaska to bring his body home. But what was interesting after that is she began to speak about Sylvia in a different way. Previously, she'd always talked about Sylvia as this difficult woman. But after Nick's death, she talked about Sylvia's illness. It was as if, for a long time, she'd had a very kind of Yorkshire pull-your-socks-up attitude. Depression isn't real. You should just get on with it. But when Nick took his own life, it was as if Olwyn finally realised depression is real, depression kills. And from that point on, she seemed to speak much more sympathetically about Sylvia. The other memorable thing she said about that was, we were just talking about all the tragedies that Ted had endured, and she said, "I'm so glad he died before Nick took his life, because that was the one thing he could not have endured." And yet Frida survives. Anne and I were both down this week at an opening of Frida's new collection of paintings and poems. And Frida has now read, I think, about half the book, and I think, like you, found it difficult. Obviously, she said she'd never read a biography of her mother or her father before. But she's a rather extraordinary survivor, isn't she?
She is. From fairly timid, not timid, she was always a child who stood back and observed. When they were very small, Nicholas was the one who wanted human contact, and Frida was the one who stood back and watched. And my memories of them were these big eyes, and Nicholas's needs were one, Frida's needs were another, and she was the one who had the more difficult time, because Frida was the one who, when in her new book of poems, she's the one who writes that she, in the women that Ted brought into their lives, she looked for the mother in them. They looked for her mother in her. And I think that the problem was that the women in Ted's life looked at Nick, and he reminded them of the man that they loved, and they looked at Frida, and they saw the woman that haunted them, that was present in their lives every day. So Frida sort of pulled back from the life, Ted's life with these women. They weren't going to be substitutes. They weren't going to work as substitutes for a mother. So for many years, she lived a very different life. She married when she was 19. She didn't have very much money. She worked in the tax office in Exeter, and in that sense, it was quite. So it was only really by the time she was in her 30s, and she went to Australia and had this different life in Australia and things, that she really began to be independent and grow as a person in her own right. She didn't read their work, so she didn't have that conflict of people saying you write like your parents and things. And she really has survived magnificently out of what has been a very, very difficult life for her. You know, I mean, to lose your mother to suicide, to lose your brother to suicide, to know that your father is seen as this devil figure in a way throughout the years that you grow up. I think she bore a lot, but she has risen through this magnificently.
Thank you. I'll just end with one more anecdote. There was a point that one night, a rainy night, Ted knocked on Frida's door, not having seen her for quite a long time. He just came and sat himself down and said, "Ask me anything." And of course, she wasn't prepared for that and just couldn't think what to ask. But then she did ask the obvious question. She said, "What was my mother like?" Because of course she was only 3 at the time of Sylvia's death. And Ted thought long and hard, and then he said, "Her hands were exactly like yours." And there's actually a rather beautiful poem in Birthday Letters where he plays on the sense of Sylvia's hands living on in Frida's. I wrote at the very end of my book that Ted Hughes loved Sylvia Plath until the day he died. And when Frida read that, she said, "Yes, that's what he told me every time that he telephoned me." Anne, thank you so much.